Mini Lesson 3, Types of Characters in Fiction. As we have learned, the characters in fiction stories are very important to the writers, telling of their stories. Understanding the characters not only helps us make meaning of the stories we read, but it also increases our enjoyment as we read them. These are some of my favorite characters in fiction. You already knew that. So types of characters are protagonists, a flat character, round, dynamic, and static. A protagonist is the central character in the story and is often referred to as the main character. He or she is faced with a conflict that must be resolved. Protagonist could be someone that we consider the hero. That's their versus against the antagonist. The antagonist is like the bad guy that causes the problem in the story. Then you have someone like a flat character. And a flat character usually only demonstrates one kind of personality or characteristic trait. Like in our folktale, Opossum's Bare Tail. The rabbit only showed one character trait, or our spider only showed us one character trait, which is greediness. That would be considered a flat character. In folktales, they're usually just flat characters. Then there's someone who's a round character. And that's where we get that saying, a very well-rounded person. Because that's a character that is anyone who has a complex personality is more fully developed in the story. They've got a lot of character traits. Then you have someone who's a dynamic character. And that is someone who changes over time and usually after resolving a conflict. So after fixing that problem that they're facing, they go head-to-head with that problem, they usually change. That's considered a dynamic character. Then you have a static character. And that is someone who doesn't change over time, and hers or her personality just remains the same. Kind of a boring character. So characters in folktales are usually just flat characters. They only show one personality trait, like foolishness or bravery. The characters definitely learn a lesson or a moral, and we've discussed that already in previous lessons. They've come down from past cultures, been passed down by generation by generation. Again, that's traditional literature. And they usually teach children a lesson. They always have a protagonist, that's the good guy, and there's always versing an antagonist, which is the bad guy. A lot of times there's animals in folk tales that have human personalities. They have one or more characters that would be very unwise. Flat characters are usually predictable, but they offer a clear message to readers. And in folk tales, there's usually that trickery feature in the story. So here we're going to see a video on characters.
Character. The final literary device necessary for a narrative is the characters that live in it. They might be people, or space aliens, or fish, or even angry birds, but they are who the story is about. Some characters are super important to the story, and we call them primary or major characters. And some are not as important, and we call them secondary or minor characters. These are the two most general character categories in stories. Some are the good guys, who we call protagonists, and some are the bad guys, who we call antagonists. We love them, we hate them, we hope they win, and cry if they lose. They are just like us, or completely different. But one way or the other, without characters, there can be no story. We can learn a lot about characters by the way they are described in stories. Here is a description of Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. What fun Dickens must have had writing this cantankerous character. From this passage, we know Scrooge is mean, cheap, keeps secrets, treats his employees poorly, and his physical description isn't much better. The meanness within him has worked its way to the outside of him, and now he is as mean and cold-looking as he feels on the inside. This description of Scrooge is early on in the story, and it tells us a lot about him. But what we haven't learned is why. What happened in his life to make him so miserable? And that's what the rest of the story is about. We can learn a lot about a narrative by deciding how important each character is. Some characters are so important to a story that without them, the story simply wouldn't exist. And we call them primary or major characters. For example, what would A Christmas Carol be without Ebenezer Scrooge? Not much, that's for sure. For this reason, Scrooge is a primary character in A Christmas Carol. Here's another way to think about primary and secondary characters in a narrative. Imagine a story about a teenage girl who dreams of one day winning a national surfing event. Every day, her friends go with her to the beach and sit on the sand in the sun, watching her and cheering her on. Sometimes she takes lessons from a professional, and other times she has to stay home to take care of her little brother. One day, she almost gets eaten by a shark. After 3 years of hard work, she enters her first surfing tournament and wins. In this story, the girl with a dream to surf is the primary character. And her friends, her coach, her little brother, even the shark may be secondary characters to the story, because without any one of them, the story could still happen. However, without the girl with a dream to surf, we just don't have a story. Another way to look at characters is by figuring out which ones are the protagonists, the good guys, and which are the antagonists, the bad guys. In the story about Little Red Riding Hood, she is the protagonist, and the wolf is the antagonist, because she was just trying to do the right thing and help her grandmother, but he was trying to eat them both. In our story about the surfing girl, she is the protagonist who is trying to do something with her life, and the shark could be seen as the antagonist. Sometimes it's not entirely clear who the protagonist and antagonists are in a story. In the novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville, Captain Ahab is the protagonist who is hunting the white whale to get revenge for biting off his leg, and the whale is the antagonist for biting off Captain Ahab's leg and hunting him. However, some might think the whale is the protagonist, because if Ahab wasn't out hunting whales, he wouldn't have gotten his leg bitten off in the first place. The whale was just protecting itself and its family. Since Ahab was trying to make a living hunting whales, the protagonist-antagonist lines become even more blurred. But for the most part, it's usually fairly easy to see who the good guys, the protagonists, and who the bad guys, the antagonists, are in stories. Let's review. Question number 1. Characters in a story can be A, people, B, space aliens, C, angry birds, D, all of the above. The answer is D. People, space aliens, angry birds, fish, talking clocks, dancing teaspoons, and so much more can all be characters in a story. The types of characters in a story are limited only by the imagination of the writer. Question number 2. Characters in a story can be split into a number of different categories, but 2 of those categories are the most general. Are they A, happy or sad characters, B, primary or secondary characters, C, the bosses and the worker characters? The answer is B, Primary or major characters and secondary or minor characters are the most general categories of characters in a story. Question 3. Who is the good guy in a story? Is it A, the protagonist, or B, the antagonist? The answer is A. The protagonist is the good guy in a story.
Writers of fiction create different types of characters, and today we're going to look at some different types of characters in a folktale titled Why Spiders Live in Dark Corners. We have read about our spider, our little friend the spider, before, and there's a new chapter called Why Spiders Live in Dark Corners. Today we're going to identify the protagonists in the folktale Why Spiders Live in Dark Corners, and find evidence to support the type of characters who demonstrate one kind of personality, such as foolishness or bravery, in order to really make a point. Remember, the character that shows one type of character trait is a flat character, and that usually shows those in folk tales. So why spiders live in dark corners? Spider lived in a house made of banana leaves with his wife, Aso, and his 2 sons. Behind the banana leaf house was a garden, and in the garden Spider and his wife had 2 sons, planted yams, corns, and tomatoes, bananas, and lemons, and oranges. When the rain came every year, the garden grew beautiful, and Spider and his family had planted to eat. Every day, Aso cooked rice and vegetables, meat, and peppers into a big stew. It was delicious, and Spider ate it until he couldn't eat no more. You might have thought Spider would be satisfied, but of course he wasn't. He wanted to even have more good things to eat. Wow, Spider's clearly our protagonist, and he seems to be just like human. He lives in a house with his wife, 2 sons, and loves to eat good food, especially stew. He could be in my family. So now we got some character traits from that he loves to eat stew. He assumes he's an animal that takes on human personalities. He lives in a house with his son and his wife and his 2 sons. He eats a stew with rice and vegetables. As I continue reading about Spider, when you raise your hand, when you notice something we should add, maybe you come across some evidence that he's taking on one kind of character trait yet to be revealed. When you notice Spider is behaving like a human, think about it and raise your hand and let us know. He wanted to eat most of the time when he was not sleeping. What can I do? Spider asked himself. There's so many good things in my garden, and yet I can't eat only half of them. I wish I could think of a way to have more. So Spider sat in his garden and thought. At last he had an idea. He told his wife he was not feeling very well, and that he was going to see the village magician. The magician knew many things and could tell what would happen next month or next year. After a while, Spider returned, and when Aso asked him what had happened, Spider told her that the magician said he was very sick and he would die. Aso and her sons were sad, but Spider only said, "Since I'm going to die soon, you must make a place to bury me, and I want you to put it here, just next to the spot where the tomatoes are growing." For Spider loved tomatoes best of all. When Aso had dug a deep hole for Spider's burial place, Spider said, "Now I want you to put some spoons and knives and forks and some cooking pots so I can feed myself when I'm in the next world." And so Aso and her sons put spoons, forks, and knives and cooking pots into the grave. One day, very soon after, Spider pretended to get sick and die. He lay very still, closed his eyes, and tried to stop breathing. Aso and her 2 sons shed many tears and put Spider in his grave just beside the tomato patch. Spider stayed in the deep grave for several days because his family had a fine funeral and many people came to mourn him. They brought food and sang funeral songs and played the funeral drums. When it was over, Spider sat up happily in his grave, but he did not mind spending the day there because he loved to sleep anyway. And when the night fell, can you guess what Spider did? Very quietly, he lifted the cover off the grave. He looked about to make sure that everyone was in bed, and when he saw that it was all safe, he crept out very slowly, Sometimes the moon was so bright that Spider could see everything in the garden. He quickly picked several of the very best tomatoes, and then he pulled up some of the best yams. He cut off some green, juicy peppers and pulled up a big onion. And Spider crept into the chicken yard and plucked himself a nice fat chicken. And when he had everything he wanted, Spider went back into the deep grave. He cooked a grand feast and ate all night long. Now, it was not long after that Aso and her sons began to notice that something was happening to the garden. Every morning, some of the best tomatoes and yams were missing. He wondered who could be stealing from their garden, so Aso thought of a clever way to catch the thief. She brought a great pile of straw. Out of this she built a man that looked just like a real man. Then Aso got a bucket of soft, sticky beeswax. She covered the straw man with a thick coat of sticky beeswax, and when she was finished, she set the man in the middle of the tomato patch. That night, as soon as everyone was asleep, Spider crept out, as usual. He was just about to pluck a big, juicy tomato when he saw a man standing in the middle of his garden. Spider was so angry he forgot all about trying to be quiet. "Who are you?" he shouted. "What are you doing in my garden?" But instead of explaining himself, the man only looked at him. "So? You won't talk, eh?" "Where's your tongue?" asked Spider. "Get out of my garden at once." But still the man said nothing. He only looked at Spider and stood still. "Do you think I'm playing? I'll teach you a lesson," screamed Spider. And with that, he hit the wax man as hard as he could with his right hand. Oof! His hand stuck fast into the beeswax. Spider could not move it, though he was pulled very hard. "So," he screamed, "you're trying to be clever. I'll show you." And he hit the wax man with his left fist, and that got stuck too. So Spider was stuck to the man with both hands. "What is this? You are really just too much," cried Spider. "Do you know who I am? I'll teach you a lesson." He gave a mighty kick to the wax man. And what do you think happened? Why, his foot stuck fast, and he could not move it. "Haven't you learned yet? Well, I'll give you another kick." And the Spider kicked the wax man with his other foot. But it, too, stuck. Now Spider was stuck hand and foot to the wax man, and he began to get a little frightened. Still, he tried again. "I'm stronger than you," he shouted, and he gave the wax man a tight squeeze, and his stomach stuck fast to the wax man. "I will win this yet," said Spider, and he butted the wax man with his head as hard as he could, and of course, his head stuck fast too. The next morning, Aso and her two sons went into the garden to see what they had caught. The thief. Imagine their surprise when they found Spider stuck to the wax man from head to foot. At once they understood everything. They pulled Spider down and took him to the chief to be judged a thief. Everyone knew who the thief was then, and the people in the village laughed at Spider and made up funny songs about him. After a time, Spider was so ashamed of himself that he ran up into the darkest corner of the ceiling to hide, and he has lived there ever since. So our friend the Spider has shown more common characteristic traits. He's a thief because he steals food from the garden. He displays dishonesty and trickery. He hides in dark corners because he's ashamed and embarrassed. Spider is stuck into beeswax and scarecrow, and he's condemned a thief, and he's ashamed because of what he has done. Flat characters such as Spider may really be predictable, but storytellers wanted them to be that way, so their tales would impact clear messages to their readers. Remember, characters in folk tales usually learn an important lesson, and these lessons represent what the various cultures valued and wanted to teach their children. Because folk tales are traditional literature, and it's been passed down by generation by generation. So, you're going to get into your groups, discuss your reads today. Everyone's got a folk tale, and they are going to complete their characters in folk tales and find the character traits that their characters show. Be sure to provide evidence. Have great discussions today, guys.